The late afternoon sun bathed Marcus Bennett's skin in a gentle warmth as he settled deeper into his favorite Adirondack chair. A subtle breeze stirred the air, rustling the leaves of the grand oak that stretched protectively over his immaculately groomed backyard. This was his sanctuary, his retreat from the relentless demands of his life as the head of the regional FBI field office. Here, in the comfort of his own home, he found solace. He closed his eyes and let the symphony of bird song and the distant hum of lawnmowers melt away the tension in his shoulders. He'd carved out this hour for himself, a precious reprieve before he returned to the whirlwind of responsibility. But the peace was fleeting. Excuse me, are you supposed to be here?" A sharp voice pierced the tranquility. Marcus's eyes snapped open. Standing at the edge of his property was a woman, her expression twisted with suspicion and something bordering on outrage. He recognized her immediately. Her name was Victoria Simmons. She had moved in the neighborhood 2 years ago and was known for her manicured flower beds, her rigid HOA enforcement, and her unnerving habit of watching people from her front window. Today, she wore a bold floral dress that seemed at odds with the tight line of disapproval on her face. "I beg your pardon," Marcus replied, sitting up straighter in his chair. He was no stranger to curious glances. His was one of the only black families in the affluent Brookdale neighborhood. But this was different. Her tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. "This is private property," Victoria said, her voice rising as she puffed up her chest. "And I don't recognize you. Are you trespassing? Because if you are, I'm calling the police right now." Marcus exhaled slowly. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but he'd lived this scene before, just never in his own backyard. "I live here, ma'am," he said, keeping his tone measured. "This is my house." He gestured behind him to the sprawling brick ranch, its wide porch lined with potted plants. Near the garage, a basketball hoop stood as evidence of his teenage son's daily drills. Victoria scoffed, her hands flying to her hips. "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "I've lived on this street for 2 years. I know everyone here, and I've never seen you before. You don't belong here." She was already pulling out her phone before Marcus could respond, her fingers flying over the screen. "I'm calling the police," she declared. "We'll let them sort this out." And then she said it, loud enough for Marcus to hear every word. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report a trespasser. There's a suspicious black man in my neighbor's backyard. I don't think he lives there. He's acting threatening, and I'm afraid for my safety." Marcus sat frozen in disbelief, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. He felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in his chest, but he fought to tamp it down. He knew better than to argue. He knew the script. Remain calm. Be polite. Hope the responding officer was reasonable. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens broke the suburban quiet. A patrol cruiser slid to a stop in front of his house, and a young white officer stepped out. His badge read, "Officer Carson." No relation, Marcus thought bitterly, to anyone he might count as an ally. Carson walked straight to Victoria, who launched into her version of events with an animated fervor. She painted Marcus as an intruder, her fear exaggerated with every word. Officer Carson nodded, his jaw setting as he turned toward Marcus. "Sir," Carson said sharply, "can you explain what you're doing here?" Marcus took a breath. "I live here," he said calmly. He gestured again toward the house, then picked up the set of keys from the small table beside his chair. "This is my home." Carson took the keys, glancing at them with a skeptical eye. His gaze flicked back to Victoria, who stood watching with a smug sort of triumph. "Ma'am," Carson said, "do you have any proof this man doesn't live here?" Victoria hesitated, her bravado faltering for the first time. "Well, no," she admitted, "but I know everyone here, and I've never seen him before. He doesn't look like he belongs in this neighborhood." For a moment, Carson seemed to waver. Then he squared his shoulders. "Sir, until we can confirm your identity and your residency, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property." Marcus stared at him, the words settling heavily on his shoulders. "You want me to leave my own property?" he said slowly, his voice thick with disbelief. It's procedure, Carson replied stiffly. Please step off the property. Marcus stood. His heart pounded with a quiet fury, but he kept his movements deliberate, non-threatening. He walked to the sidewalk, feeling the weight of their gazes on his back. Curtains twitched in the neighboring houses as more onlookers peered out. He stood there, humiliated and exposed. Pulling his phone from his pocket, he scrolled through his contacts. He found a name he needed and hit call. Agent Reynolds, came the gruff voice on the other end. Reynolds, it's Bennett, Marcus said, keeping his tone low and controlled. I need a favor. What's going on? Reynolds asked, concern creeping into his voice. I'm at my house. Brookdale. I need you to run my name and address through the local PD and have Officer Carson call you back. There was a pause. Then on it, Officer Carson watched Marcus as he made the call. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Victoria was still talking, her voice a stream of self-righteous outrage that seemed to fuel his doubt. But he didn't want to lose face. Not in front of her. Not yet. Minutes later, Carson's radio crackled to life, followed by the sharp ring of his cell phone. He picked it up, his expression tightening as he listened. This is Officer Carson, he said. The voice on the other end was brisk. Officer Carson, this is Special Agent Reynolds with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Do you have an individual named Marcus Bennett at the address of 4720 Oak Ridge Drive? Yes, Carson answered, his voice suddenly uncertain. We received a call about a potential trespasser. That trespasser is Marcus Bennett, special agent in charge of the local FBI field office. I suggest you rectify this situation immediately. Officer Carson blanched. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He turned to Victoria, motioning for her to step aside. Ma'am, he hissed under his breath. Do you have any idea who that man is? That's Marcus Bennett, the head of the FBI in this region. You just called the cops on the director of the FBI. Victoria's eyes widened. Her self-assured posture wilted, her face draining of color. Carson turned back to Marcus. Director Bennett, he began, his voice suddenly deferential. I'm so sorry. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Marcus's jaw tightened. A misunderstanding, he repeated flatly. You saw a black man in his own backyard, and without a shred of evidence, you took the word of a woman who admitted she didn't even know me. That's not a misunderstanding. That's bias. Victoria was trembling now, her bravado gone, replaced with something like fear. Marcus's eyes found hers. And you, he said, his voice low and cutting, owe me and this entire community an apology. You weaponize your prejudice and call the police because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs here. Victoria's lip quivered. I didn't know, she stammered. I was just trying to protect. Protect it from what? Marcus snapped. From black men sitting in their own backyards. She was silent. Marcus pulled out his phone again. I'll be filing a formal complaint, he told Carson. And I suggest both of you speak to an attorney. You may be hearing from mine. The fallout was swift. Officer Carson was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The local news ran with the story. Footage of Marcus standing on the sidewalk went viral within hours, his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation striking a nerve. Conversations erupted across the city about racial profiling and police accountability. Victoria Simmons found herself shunned. Her house went on the market within a month. She moved away, her reputation in tatters. And Marcus? Marcus Bennett turned his anger into action. He partnered with community leaders to push for mandatory bias training in the police department. He worked with city officials to implement new policies aimed at curbing racial profiling. He even established a scholarship fund in his son's name, aimed at helping underprivileged youth from marginalized communities. He could have destroyed Victoria's life. He had the power, but instead, he chose to focus on the bigger fight, one that stretched beyond his backyard. As he sat once more in his Adirondack chair, the setting sun casting a golden hue across his lawn, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in days. Peace and determination. Because he knew the fight wasn't over. But he also knew he was ready. One backyard at a time.